Imagine boarding a plane, expecting nothing more than a quiet, uneventful journey. But for Lewis Carter, a 68-year-old black man battling cancer, this flight would become a battlefield, one where the fight wasn't just for a meal, but for dignity itself. It started as a simple request, a meal he had ordered, something necessary for his health. But when the flight attendant, Charlotte, took one glance at him and refused to check, the air in the cabin grew thick with something unspoken, something far more dangerous than hunger. Then came the whispers, then came the tension, and then, 6 minutes later, came a decision that no one on board saw coming. As the truth unraveled, passengers were forced to pick sides. Would they pretend nothing had happened? Or would they acknowledge what was staring them right in the face? As the stakes escalated, one question became impossible to ignore. Was this just a misunderstanding or something much deeper? Something much older? Where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If this story grabs your attention, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's get into it. This is the story of Flight 402. At first, it was just a request. A simple, quiet request, made in the way that men like Lewis Carter had learned to ask for things in this country politely. Without assumption, without too much weight in their voice. He had asked this way since he was a boy, growing up in a world that had always told him to be careful about how much space he took up, about how loud he was, about how much he needed. Now, at 68 years old, sick and tired in more ways than one, Lewis sat in seat 17B of Flight 402, a plane cutting its way from New York to Atlanta, and spoke in that same quiet voice. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, lifting his eyes to the flight attendant hovering over him. "I requested a special meal. I can't eat the regular food on account of my condition." Charlotte Benson, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, the kind of woman who moved through the world with the ease of knowing it would always make space for her, didn't even bother looking at him directly. She skimmed the list on her clipboard, frowned slightly, then shook her head. "I don't see your name here, sir. If you didn't request it properly in advance, I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." Her voice was pleasant, but clipped, final. Lewis knew that tone. Oh, he knew it too well. Still, he tried again, leaning forward slightly, the effort making his ribs ache. "I did request it. Before the flight. I double-checked." Charlotte let out a small, exasperated sigh, not loud, but enough for him to hear. Enough for him to know that his mere existence had just become an inconvenience. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, this time with the tight-lipped smile of someone who wasn't sorry at all. "But if it's not on the list, it's not on the list." And just like that, the decision was made, not because the meal didn't exist, because it did. Not because she couldn't find a way to accommodate him, because she could. But because she didn't feel she had to. The air changes. Lewis sat back, fingers tightening around the armrest. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. No, it was just another small moment. Another paper cut in a lifetime full of them. A white cashier gripping a $20 bill too tightly, holding it up to the light like his hands were less trustworthy than the next man's. A woman on the sidewalk clutching her purse just a little closer when he passed by. As if his age, his frail body, his tired eyes didn't matter, only his skin did. And now this. It was only a meal. But it wasn't only a meal. Lewis swallowed, eyes flickering to the passengers around him. Some had noticed, their heads turning slightly, their eyes lingering a beat too long before shifting away. Most of them white, most of them choosing not to get involved. But not all of them. The woman in 18A, Angela, a younger black woman, probably in her early 40s, was watching, her lips pressed together, her fingers drumming against the tray table. She leaned forward slightly. "They got food up there, don't they?" she murmured, just loud enough for Lewis to hear. "They always got something extra." Lewis gave a small shake of his head. It wasn't worth making a scene. It never was. But the air in the cabin had changed. Charlotte, sensing the shift, straightened up, flipping her clipboard shut with a decisive snap. "I have other passengers to serve," she said, then turned on her heel and walked away, her ponytail swinging behind her. Lewis exhaled, slow and measured. He wasn't surprised, but he was tired. The undercurrents. It should have ended there. But racism in America never ends where you think it should. It lingers, stretches itself out, embeds itself into the very air. 5 minutes later, a flight attendant walked past Louis, carrying a tray. He glanced up, just in time to see Charlotte, smiling warmly, bending down to hand a glass of wine to a white passenger in first class. No clipboard, no list, no hesitation. Angela saw it too. Her voice came sharp this time, slicing through the hum of the plane. Funny how there's always food and drinks when certain people ask. The murmur started then, not loud, not yet, but it spread like ink in water. Slow, reaching. The passengers had seen. They might not say it outright, but they had seen. And Charlotte? Charlotte had felt it. The weight tension had thickened the air. She turned, eyes flicking back to Louis, then to Angela. And for the first time, just for a moment, she looked uncertain. But uncertainty is a dangerous thing when it comes to privilege. Because when people like Charlotte start to feel uncertain, they don't question themselves. They don't stop and reflect. They double down. The storm brewing. Charlotte's footsteps clicked faster as she walked away, her spine stiff. A few rows up. A man in a navy suit, white, early 50s, cleared his throat and glanced toward Angela with mild disapproval. "Was that necessary?" he muttered. Angela turned fully in her seat now, leveling him with a look. "Was what necessary? Calling out the double standard?" The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Everything isn't about race, you know." And there it was, the age-old gaslight, the words that have been used for centuries to silence, to dismiss, to make men like Louis and women like Angela feel as though they were imagining things, as though their experiences weren't real. Angela's nostrils flared. She turned back, shaking her head, muttering under her breath, "Yeah, everything's not about race, until it is." And Louis? Louis sat there, quiet. He had learned, long ago, that when you were black in America, you had to pick your battles. You couldn't fight them all. You had to choose when to push and when to let things go. But something in his chest ached. Something deeper than hunger. Because today, on this flight, this moment wasn't a battle he had chosen. It was one that had chosen him. And whether he wanted it or not, it wasn't over yet. The plane hummed with a quiet that was not truly quiet at all. It was the kind of silence that followed a moment when something had shifted. When people had seen something they didn't want to see. When an invisible but undeniable line had been drawn between what was comfortable and what was true. Louis Carter sat still, staring at the tray table before him. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe for the discomfort to pass. Maybe for anyone to say something that would make this moment feel less familiar. But familiarity was a heavy thing. Behind him, Angela had settled into her seat again, but her fingers still tapped restlessly against the armrest, a metronome counting out the beat of her frustration. The man in the navy suit, David. His name was David. Louis caught it when the flight attendant served him his whiskey, had gone back to reading his newspaper. But not before shaking his head. As if the conversation had exhausted him. As if acknowledging what had just happened was more draining than experiencing it. And Charlotte, the flight attendant, had disappeared down the aisle, her stiff posture betraying the tension she refused to show on her face. It was done. Or at least, it should have been. The smoldering heat. The thing about moments like these is that they do not truly end. They settle. They sink into the atmosphere. They linger beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest thing to spark them back to life. That spark came sooner than anyone expected. Because just as Charlotte reappeared, moving briskly down the aisle with that same clipboard clutched tightly in her hands, another flight attendant, James Harrison, stepped into view. James was tall, black, with the kind of quiet authority that made people sit up a little straighter when he entered a room. He had been working for the airline for years, long enough to know that trouble on a plane didn't always come in the form of a screaming passenger or a mechanical failure. Sometimes, it came in the form of a moment like this, small, contained, but dangerous in a way that most people would never recognize. James had seen Charlotte's reaction. He had seen the way the air changed. And he had seen Louis Carter sitting there, silent in a way that was too familiar, too heavy. So he asked the only question that mattered. "What's going on here?" Charlotte stopped mid-stride, blinking at him as if she had just been caught in something she hadn't quite realized she was doing. "Nothing," she said, too quickly. "It was just a misunderstanding." James turned to Louis, his expression unreadable. "Sir?" Louis hesitated. He had spent a lifetime deciding whether to speak or to swallow. And swallowing, more often than not, was easier. But before he could answer, Angela, God bless that woman, leaned forward and spoke instead. "It's not nothing," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "He asked for a meal he was supposed to get, and she refused to give it to him." Charlotte's face flushed. "That's not." She didn't check. Angela continued, voice rising just slightly. "She didn't even try." The murmuring started again, low but growing, passengers shifting in their seats, eyes darting from Charlotte to James to Louis. Charlotte, now visibly flustered, let out a nervous laugh. "Look, I was just following policy. He wasn't on the list." "Were the people in first class on the list when you brought them drinks without checking?" Angela asked. Silence. And there it was, laid bare for everyone to see. The kind of silence that only comes when there's no good way to answer a question without exposing the truth. James exhaled, slow and measured, then turned back to Charlotte. "Where's the meal?" Charlotte hesitated. "Charlotte," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Where's the meal? I don't think we have one left." Angela laughed, short and bitter. "Don't think?" she echoed. "Or don't want to look?" The first shockwave. That was it. That was the moment when the fault line cracked. When the thing that had been bubbling under the surface finally rose to meet them. A man across the aisle, white, balding, with a southern drawl that stretched his words like warm honey, shifted in his seat. "Now listen," he said, looking toward Angela. "Maybe we ought to let this go. No need to make it into a whole thing." Angela turned sharply. "A whole thing?" she repeated, incredulous. "Oh, so now it's a thing because we're talking about it?" James turned back to Charlotte, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Go check." Charlotte hesitated for only a second before turning on her heel and hurrying toward the galley. But the damage had been done. Because now there was no pretending that this wasn't about more than a meal. Now, everyone had seen it, how fast she had been to say no. How slow she had been to admit that maybe, just maybe, she could be wrong. Louis sat there, hands clasped together, feeling something settle in his bones. It had happened again. But this time, it wasn't going unnoticed. And that was new. The escalation. Charlotte returned 3 minutes later, carrying a meal tray. She placed it in front of Louis, her expression unreadable, her hands shaking just slightly. "There," she said, voice clipped. "Happy now?" And just like that, the murmuring turned into something more. Because there it was, naked and ugly, the resentment, the indignation, the deep-seated belief that she wasn't just being asked to correct a mistake. She was being forced to acknowledge something she didn't want to acknowledge. Louis looked at the tray, then up at her. He saw it in her face, the anger, the frustration, the way she wanted to be seen as the victim now, as the one being unfairly called out. He had seen that look before, too. A white boy in his neighborhood, long ago, who had shoved him first, but cried harder when the teacher caught them. A store owner who had followed him through every aisle, but had called him aggressive when he finally asked why. It was always the same. Always. Angela let out a breath, shaking her head. "Unbelievable," she muttered. James glanced at Charlotte, his face unreadable. "Go help the other passengers." She turned, practically stomping away, and James looked down at Louis. "You good, sir?" Louis nodded, slow and deliberate, but inside, something burned. Not anger, not quite. Something deeper, something older. Because it had never been about a meal. It had never been about a list. It had always been about how easily some people could say no. And how much harder others had to fight for a simple, quiet yes. The plane moved forward. The world kept turning. But something had shifted. And this time, the silence would not be enough to bury it. For a moment, just a moment, there was stillness. Louis Carter looked down at the meal tray now sitting before him. Untouched. His fingers curled around the edge of the table, pressing just enough to steady himself. The plane was moving forward, cruising at 30,000 feet. But here, in seat 17B, something had stalled. Charlotte had disappeared down the aisle, her shoulders tight with resentment. The kind that comes when someone is forced to acknowledge a truth they would rather ignore. The kind that comes when a system, one that had always favored you, suddenly, just for a moment, does not. James Harrison, the black flight attendant, lingered for a second longer than he had to. His eyes met Louis's, and in that brief exchange, there was a knowing, an understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "Let me know if you need anything else, sir," James said, his voice steady, respectful. Louis nodded. And then James was gone. And the quiet returned. But it was not a peaceful quiet. No, this was the silence of a room that had been filled with tension and had not yet found a way to let it go. The low hum of discomfort. Louis picked up the plastic fork. His hands moving slow. He should eat. He needed to eat. His body was failing him in ways he tried not to think about. And food was no longer just food. It was fuel, medicine, time. But the hunger that sat in his gut now had nothing to do with his illness. It was the hunger of a man who had been made to ask for what should have already been his. A hunger that would not be satisfied with a meal. A few rows back, Angela sighed loudly, shaking her head. You see how she threw that tray down? Like she was the one being wronged? The man in the navy suit, David, whose patience had already worn thin, let out a sharp breath, snapping his newspaper shut. Some of us would like to have a peaceful flight. If that's not too much to ask, he muttered, his voice clipped. Angela turned fully this time, her eyes narrowing. A peaceful flight? She repeated, slow and deliberate. You mean a flight where you don't have to acknowledge what just happened? A flight where we just pretend it didn't? David's mouth tightened. I mean a flight where people don't turn small misunderstandings into national crises. A murmur spread through the cabin. There it was, the dismissal, the casual reduction of what had just taken place. A misunderstanding, a mistake, nothing to see here, nothing to question, nothing to examine. Angela let out a sharp, humorless laugh. That's convenient, she said. David shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. I just think we need to stop making everything about race. The fire catches. The words landed like a match against dry wood. Angela leaned forward, her voice now carrying enough weight that nearby passengers shifted. Some leaning in, some turning away, suddenly very interested in their seatbelts, their phone screens. Anything but this. Oh, is that what we need? She said, her voice full of something sharp and ancient. We need to stop making it about race? Let me ask you something. Sir, when's the last time someone looked at you and decided whether you deserved something based on nothing but what you looked like? When's the last time you had to prove yourself for something that should have been yours already? David bristled. I didn't say that. You didn't have to say it. Angela snapped. We heard you just fine. The tension had weight now. It pressed against the cabin walls, thickening the air. People were watching, listening. And Charlotte, standing a few rows away, had gone pale. She had thought the moment had passed, that it was done. But nothing stays buried forever. Not when the wound is still fresh. Not when the truth is still raw. James had returned to the front of the cabin, watching. He had seen this before. He had lived it before. A single moment, an injustice so small it could be excused, brushed aside until someone refused to let it go. And when that happened, it was never the guilty party who bore the weight of the fallout. It was the ones who had dared to call it what it was. The shift. David exhaled, shifting in his seat. Look, he said, his voice carefully modulated, as if trying to regain control of the situation. I'm just saying we should all try to get along. There's no need to be divisive. Angela's laugh came short and bitter. Divisive? She repeated. You think we're the ones causing division? We didn't create this, sir. We didn't build the rules. We just learned how to survive them. David rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. Now, nobody is out to get you. Louis finally looked up. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It did not need to be. No, he said. Then why did I have to fight for a meal I was supposed to have? David's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched. Charlotte shifted, looking anywhere but at Louis. Angela leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. Yeah, she said, quieter now, but no less sharp. That's what I thought. The crack in the foundation. The plane, physically, had not changed. It still hummed along, still moved forward, still obeyed the laws of gravity and speed. But the cabin? The people in it? Something had broken open. Because moments like this, moments where the truth was forced into the open, did not just disappear. They did not fade like old conversations. They left something behind. A tension, an unease, a realization that what had been ignored for so long could not be ignored anymore. Charlotte walked briskly toward the back of the plane, her breath uneven. She needed a moment. James met her in the galley. You okay? He asked. But he already knew the answer. Her voice was thin when she spoke. I didn't do anything wrong. James tilted his head. Then why are you running? Charlotte's lips pressed together. In the cabin, Louis exhaled. He picked up his fork, finally, and took a bite of the food. It was cold, but the taste didn't matter. Because today, for the first time in a long time, he had made them see. And some things, once seen, could never be unseen. There was a moment when everything seemed to hold still. A breath caught between what had already happened and what was still coming. Louis Carter set his fork down, the metal clinking against the tray with a sharp sound that felt louder than it was. He was not a man prone to outbursts. He had spent his whole life learning how to hold himself in. How to step carefully through a world that was quick to punish those who dared to stand too tall. Too proud, too aware. But the problem with swallowing things down is that eventually, there is no room left inside you. Angela was still staring at David, the white businessman who had dared to call this a misunderstanding, who had dared to act as if the real problem was the reaction to injustice, rather than the injustice itself. David, for his part, had stiffened. He knew they all knew that the conversation had spiraled out of his control. He had tried to smooth it over. Tried to pretend that all of this was just an unfortunate mix-up. A technical error. A simple mistake. But there was no escaping it now. Charlotte had disappeared into the galley. And James, the black flight attendant, had gone after her. The passengers, those who had been pretending not to listen, pretending to focus on their books or their seatbelt signs or the safety pamphlets they had never once bothered to read, were all awake now, some shifting in discomfort, some watching with rapt attention. Because this was what made America nervous. Not the violence, not the open brutality, but the truth, laid bare, the edges fray. David, still holding onto some vestige of control, exhaled sharply and turned back toward the window. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. Angela scoffed. Ridiculous? She repeated, louder now. You know what's ridiculous? A grown man sitting here, pretending not to see what's happening right in front of his face. David turned back, jaw tightening. I do see what's happening, he said, voice laced with irritation. I see people trying to turn everything into a racial issue. Even when it's not. There it was. Angela leaned forward. Tell me something, she said, voice deceptively calm. If this wasn't about race, then why did she refuse to check the list for him? But not for anyone else? Why was she so quick to say no? David's lips pressed together. He was not a fool. He knew better than to say the quiet part out loud. But that did not mean he had to admit it. He tried another route. Look, maybe she made a mistake. But you all, he gestured vaguely between Angela and Louis. You're making this bigger than it has to be. Angela let out a bitter laugh. Bigger than it has to be? She echoed. Sir, this isn't big enough. Not yet. Louis shifted in his seat. He had been quiet, letting Angela take the lead, letting her fight the battle he had fought so many times before. But now, as he listened to David twist the narrative into something it was not, something it had never been, he felt something rise in his chest. He turned his head slowly. You ever been hungry before, son? Louis asked, his voice rough but steady. David blinked, caught off guard. I don't mean missing a meal here and there. Louis continued. I mean the kind of hungry that stays with you. That follows you. The kind that makes you weak. The kind that makes you forget what it feels like to be full. David shifted uncomfortably. I've been that kind of hungry. Louis said. I've been the kind of hungry that makes a man pray for mercy in the middle of the night. So when I ask for a meal I was supposed to have and somebody looks me in the eye and says no, without even checking, you don't get to tell me that ain't about race. David opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because what could he say? That Louis was imagining it? That he was wrong? There were some arguments that men like David could not win. Not because they lacked the will, but because they lacked the truth. The backlash. At the front of the plane, Charlotte was pacing in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like she could squeeze the tension out of her bones. James stood in front of her, arms crossed. You need to calm down, he said. Charlotte's eyes snapped to his. You don't understand, she hissed. They're ganging up on me. They're making me look like a racist. James exhaled, shaking his head. Nobody has to make you look like anything. Charlotte. She sucked in a breath. I was following policy. Policy, James said, the word rolling off his tongue slow, deliberate. Tell me something. If a white man had asked for that meal, would you have checked the list? Charlotte's face twisted, her body stiffening. Be honest. James pressed. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. That's not fair, she whispered. James nodded. Yeah, he said, it's not. But he wasn't talking about her. And she knew it. The point of no return. Back in the cabin, the tension had reached a fever pitch. Angela was shaking her head, muttering under her breath. David was sitting stiffly in his seat, looking like a man who had just realized the storm he thought he had avoided was now directly above him. And Louis? Louis sat there, staring straight ahead, his hands steady on his lap. There was a moment when he thought about letting it go. But then he thought about all the times he had let it go before. About the cashier who checked his bills twice when the white woman ahead of him had paid with the same crumpled 20s. About the job he had been turned down for with a polite smile and a, "We've decided to go in a different direction." About the officer who had pulled him over for driving too carefully. And about all the men who had sat in seats just like this. Tired and sick and weary. Who had been told to stop making a fuss. To stop stirring the pot. To stop demanding things that they should have already had. He thought about all of them. And then he did something he had never done before. He pressed the call button. The small light flickered on above him. And the ding echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Passengers turned. Eyes widened. Angela's lips curled into something close to a smile. David let out a tight breath. His hands clenching. Charlotte, still in the galley, went rigid. And James, seeing the light, seeing the look in Louis's eyes, knew exactly what was about to happen. He nodded. Then he stepped forward. And the plane, once so comfortable in its silence, braced for impact. The call button was still glowing. That small light, that ding, had set off something in the air, a tension so thick it clung to every breath. Every glance, every shifting seat in the narrow, confined space of the cabin. Louis Carter sat still, his face calm, his hands folded in his lap. But inside, something was moving, something heavy and unrelenting. Something that had been carried for too long. This was not about hunger. This was not about a meal. This was about the weight of a lifetime. The quiet and insidious ways a man could be diminished. Not by one great tragedy, but by 1,000 small, sharp wounds, each one cutting just deep enough to remind him where he stood. Now, the question was whether anyone else would have the courage to see it. The dividing line. James Harrison, the black flight attendant, stepped forward. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes, the way they flickered from Louis to the other passengers, then back to the glowing call button, said everything. He knew. He had always known. "Sir," James said, his voice even, controlled, "how can I assist you?" Louis didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch. Let the moment sit where it needed to. Let every set of watching eyes settle on what was happening. Then he lifted his gaze. "I want to file a complaint," Louis said. His voice was not raised, but it carried. Charlotte, who had emerged from the galley, went pale. James nodded. "I understand. Would you like to speak privately when we land?" "No," Louis said. "I'd like to speak now." The plane was still moving forward. But inside the cabin, everything felt suspended, as if the world had shrunk down to just this moment. Just this confrontation between what was acceptable and what was no longer tolerable. Angela exhaled sharply. Like she had been holding her breath. Like she hadn't been sure whether or not Louis would go through with it. David, the white businessman in the navy suit, shifted uncomfortably, like a man realizing the conversation had officially gone somewhere he could no longer ignore. And Charlotte? Charlotte stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the hem of her uniform, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to interject, wanted to explain, wanted to say something to pull herself out of the fire she had walked into. But this was the thing about moments like these. There was no easy way out. The unraveling. James turned, his face unreadable. "Charlotte," he said, her breath hitched slightly. "Yes? Can you confirm what happened earlier?" James asked, his voice carefully neutral. Charlotte blinked. She was caught, and she knew it, but knowing it and admitting it were two very different things. She started, then stopped, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. "I followed policy," she finally said, forcing her voice into something resembling confidence. A murmur rippled through the passengers. Angela let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Policy?" she repeated. "That's the best you got?" Charlotte's face twisted. her discomfort now turning into something else, something defensive, something resentful. She looked at James, almost pleadingly, but James didn't move, didn't step in to shield her, didn't offer her an easy exit. This was hers to carry. So she turned to Lewis instead, eyes flashing with something dangerously close to anger. "I was just following policy," she snapped. "You weren't on the list." Lewis tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And yet," he said, his voice as smooth as steel, "some people weren't on the list. And they still got what they asked for." Charlotte's face went red. James exhaled, "Charlotte." But before he could finish, she turned, eyes flashing. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice rising. "I didn't do anything wrong. You're all ganging up on me, twisting this into something it's not." There it was. The shift. The moment when the victim became the villain. And the villain, through sheer force of deflection, tried to make herself the victim again. Angela shook her head. "Oh, here we go," she muttered. Charlotte's breath came faster, her voice now carrying further than she intended. "You're acting like I was trying to be unfair. Like I'm some kind of racist." David, still stiff in his seat, exhaled loudly and muttered, "Well, this is getting out of hand." Angela snapped toward him. "Getting out of hand?" she repeated. It was out of hand the second she looked at a black man and decided he wasn't worth the same effort as everyone else. James, still trying to keep order, lifted a hand. "All right, let's." But Lewis, quiet until now, spoke again. "You didn't think it would be noticed, did you?" Charlotte turned to him, startled. His voice was calm, but beneath it was something deeper. Something that made the cabin feel smaller, more intimate. "You thought it would be like all the other times," Lewis said. "A refusal, a quiet dismissal, a moment that didn't matter. You thought I'd let it go." Charlotte's lips pressed together. James sighed. "Sir, no," Lewis interrupted, his voice never rising, but somehow carrying even more weight. "I want to say this." James hesitated, then nodded. Lewis shifted slightly in his seat. He was tired, his body worn from a battle much older than this one. But his voice was steady. "I have lived through too many moments like this," he said, his eyes locked onto Charlotte's. "Moments where a person in power looks at me and makes a decision about what I deserve. About what I should accept." Charlotte swallowed hard. Lewis kept going. "And I have lived long enough to know that those moments only matter when they are seen." He let that sit. Then, finally, he leaned back. "That's all," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you saw it too." The aftermath. Silence. A deep, resounding silence. James finally exhaled, nodding slightly. "I'll file the report." Charlotte stood there, frozen in place, her face a war between shame and anger. Angela smirked. "Still think it's not about race?" she asked David. David didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. The plane moved forward. And now, nothing could be unseen. The plane was still in motion. But inside the cabin, it felt like time had stalled. The weight of Lewis Carter's words had not simply landed, they had settled. Taken root, expanded into the air like something physical. Something that could not be ignored. James Harrison, the black flight attendant, stood firm, his posture still professional, but his eyes flickered with something deeper. Something that said he knew this was more than just a complaint. Charlotte, the white flight attendant, had gone stiff, her breath uneven, her hands clenched into tight, trembling fists at her sides. She was no longer just an employee following company policy, she was a woman exposed. Raw, vulnerable in a way that people like her were not used to being. And she didn't like it. The other passengers? They were caught between two instincts. The first was the instinct to look away, to pretend none of this was happening, to go back to their books, their drinks, their headphones, anything but this moment. The second? The second was curiosity. The undeniable pull of witnessing something unfold that had been brewing beneath the surface for far longer than this flight. And at the center of it all sat Lewis Carter. Calm but unshaken. A man who had spent his whole life understanding the way moments like this worked. This wasn't new, but for once, he was no longer the only one forced to hold its weight. The breaking point. "I'll file the report," James had said, his voice steady, final. But Charlotte was not done. Because when people like Charlotte were confronted, when they were made to see themselves in a way they had never been forced to before, they did not reflect, they did not sit with it. They defended. Her face, still flushed, twisted with something dangerous humiliation. "This isn't fair," she blurted out, her voice rising before she could stop herself. James turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" Charlotte's hands clenched tighter. This is ridiculous. I did nothing wrong. You're turning this into something it's not." Angela let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You sure about that?" Charlotte turned sharply. "Yes, I was just following policy." "Whose policy?" Angela shot back. "The one where you get to decide who gets treated like a human being and who doesn't." Charlotte exhaled sharply, her entire body radiating frustration. "I didn't mean to." Louis lifted a hand, not to silence her, but to cut through the chaos before it spiraled further. And when he spoke, it was with the quiet force of a man who did not need to yell to be heard. "Nobody said you meant to," he said, "but you did it all the same." Charlotte flinched like she had been struck. Because that was the thing she could not fight against. The realization that intent did not erase impact. The fact that she had done what she had done because it had never occurred to her to do otherwise. She had seen a black man ask for something, and she had dismissed him without a second thought. Because she could. And only now, only in this moment, did she realize that it had cost her something she had never expected: her illusion of innocence. The backlash, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. People were shifting in their seats, glancing at one another, some nodding in quiet agreement, others stiffening, feeling the discomfort that came with being confronted with a reality they had spent their whole lives ignoring. David, the white businessman in the navy suit, sighed heavily. "All right," he muttered. "Enough. We've all got places to be." Angela's head snapped toward him. "Oh, I'm sorry. Are we inconveniencing you?" David shook his head, exasperated. "I'm just saying, what's the point of all this? What do you want? You want her fired? You want an apology?" He turned to Louis. "What exactly do you want?" Louis studied him, letting the question hang in the air. Then, finally, he spoke. "I want you to sit in this moment," he said. David frowned. "What?" "I want you to sit in it," Louis repeated, his voice quiet but unwavering. "I want you to feel what it's like to have the air around you shift because of something that wasn't your fault. I want you to feel the weight of something you didn't ask for. Something you didn't create, but something you now had to deal with all the same." David stared at him. The plane was still moving forward, the hum of the engine filling the space between words. Louis exhaled, slow, because that's what it's like to live in this skin. Every single day. Silence. A deep, thick silence. And then, Charlotte inhaled sharply, turned, and walked away. James didn't stop her. He didn't move to comfort her. Didn't chase after her to tell her it was all right. Because it wasn't. And he knew, as well as Louis did, that some truths had to be sat with. The fallout. Angela shook her head. "She'll cry about this later. You know," she muttered. "She'll cry and tell someone how hard this was for her. And they'll comfort her. Tell her she's still a good person. Tell her it was just a misunderstanding." Louis nodded once. "I know. And nothing will change." Louis looked at her, his eyes sharp with something heavy. "Something old. Something always changes," he said, "even if it's just the way people see themselves." Angela exhaled, sitting back in her seat. James nodded toward Louis. "Let me know if you need anything else." Louis smiled, tired but steady. "I already got what I needed." And with that, James walked away, the passengers slowly beginning to settle, the tension still lingering but no longer burning as hot. The moment had passed, but the weight of it remained. And somewhere, in the back of the plane, Charlotte was sitting alone in the galley, hands shaking, staring at the floor, realizing, maybe for the first time, that the world she had always believed in was not as simple as she had thought. That her actions had consequences. That the things she had been taught about fairness, about decency, about who was deserving of what, were not as true as she had always believed. And the thing about truth? Once you see it, you can never unsee it again. At first, there was only silence, the kind that stretched, thick and heavy, the kind that wrapped itself around every seat, every overhead compartment, every inch of the pressurized cabin. Louis Carter sat still, his hands folded, his breathing measured. He had learned, a long time ago, how to withstand this kind of quiet. The quiet that came after an ugly truth had been spoken. The quiet that followed when people were forced to sit in their own discomfort, in the sharp edges of a reality they wished to ignore. He had seen it before. He had lived it before. And still, after all these years, It was the same. Charlotte had disappeared into the galley. David had gone stiff in his seat. His eyes locked on nothing in particular. Unwilling to look at Louis. Unwilling to look at himself. Angela, still beside him, let out a breath, shaking her head. They never like it when they have to sit in it. Do they? Louis didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The answer was all around them. Because the thing about moments like these, the thing that people like David, people like Charlotte, never understood was that no one ever wanted to be the villain in their own story. And yet, here they were. The pushback. The murmurs had started again. Not loud, not yet, but spreading. Passengers exchanging glances, whispering to one another, some shaking their heads, some nodding as though they had been waiting for a moment like this. A moment to see something exposed that had always been there, just beneath the surface. And then, from the front of the plane, a new voice entered the fray. A man in first class, older, white, his suit crisp, his hair graying at the temples, turned in his seat. His voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. What exactly is the issue here? Angela turned her head, raising an eyebrow. Oh, you want to get involved now? The man straightened. I've been listening to this entire thing. And quite frankly, I don't see why this is turning into such a spectacle. Angela exhaled sharply, but it was Louis who spoke next. A spectacle? He repeated. Slow and measured. The man gestured vaguely. This debate over whether or not a flight attendant made a mistake. It's a bit much, isn't it? There was something in his tone, something dismissive, something final, like he was offering everyone the chance to move on. Louis studied him. Then he smiled, just slightly. You ever seen a house on fire? He asked. The man blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift. What? A house? Louis said again. On fire. You ever seen one burn? The man hesitated. Number. I suppose I haven't. Louis nodded, thoughtful. It doesn't happen all at once. You know, not the way people think. A house doesn't just go up in flames. He tilted his head. It starts small, a flicker, a spark, the kind of thing you could miss if you weren't paying attention. And then, before you know it, the whole thing is burning. And you're standing there wondering how it got so bad. The man frowned. I don't see what that has to do with. Louis leaned forward. This, he said, his voice calm, steady, but pressing in, is a spark. And suddenly, the plane did not feel so steady anymore. The clash, the murmurs grew louder. Another passenger, a white woman, younger, maybe in her 30s, shifted in her seat and muttered, honestly, this is uncomfortable. Angela turned fully now, her eyes flashing. Uncomfortable? This is uncomfortable for you? She let out a sharp laugh. Imagine that. The woman's face reddened. I just mean this isn't the time or place for this kind of discussion. Louis chuckled, low and deep. When is the time? The woman blinked. When exactly? Louis continued. Do we get to have the conversation? When is the right time? Because I've spent my whole life waiting for the right time. And I'm starting to think that time only comes when it's convenient for you. The woman didn't answer. And David, still sitting stiffly in his seat, still unwilling to fully look Louis in the eyes, shifted uncomfortably. This is getting out of hand, he muttered. Angela shot him a sharp look. No, this is getting honest. Louis exhaled, shaking his head. No, she's right, you know. Angela frowned, turning to him. Louis gestured vaguely at the woman. At David, at all of them. This is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. He paused, letting that sit. Because nothing ever changes when people feel comfortable. The crack in the foundation. Up front, James had returned. His expression was unreadable, but he had seen it all, had watched the conversation swell and shift and morph into something bigger than any of them. He knew what was coming next. And sure enough, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice, steady, rehearsed. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your cooperation in maintaining a calm and respectful environment during the remainder of our flight. Louis smiled to himself. There it was, the moment when a system, faced with its own reflection, tried to smooth it over. The moment when the real priority became clear, not justice, not resolution, but order. Angela scoffed. There it is, the let's all settle down speech. Louis nodded. They always come back to order. Because that was how these things worked. The world was not afraid of injustice. It was afraid of disturbance. But the thing about disturbance? It was the first step toward change. The beginning of something else. Charlotte was still gone. David was still pretending he hadn't been rattled. The man in first class had gone quiet, staring ahead like he wished he had never spoken. And Lewis sat back in his seat, closing his eyes for just a moment. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because the thing about sparks? Once they catch, they don't go out easily. And somewhere, deep in his bones, he knew. The fire had already started. The plane still moved forward. But the air inside the cabin had shifted. Stretched thin and tight, like a wire wound too tightly. Humming with the weight of something unspoken but undeniable. Lewis Carter sat still, but he was not silent. Silence had been a companion to him all his life. A thing taught to him by men who did not want to hear what he had to say. By a country that had spent centuries telling men like him that their words did not matter. But words had weight. And today, they had landed. Across the aisle, David sat stiffly, still gripping the armrest like he was bracing for turbulence. He had spent his whole life sure of his place in the world. Certain that his discomfort mattered more than the truth. And Charlotte was still gone. She had fled to the back of the plane. Not because she was in danger. Not because she had been wronged. But because she had come face to face with something she could not outrun. Herself. That was the thing about moments like these. They did not end when the words stopped. They stayed. They settled into the skin. Into the spaces between breath and thought. Into the places where certainty once lived. And that was what frightened people the most. The inevitable collapse. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice. Still steady. Still rehearsed, but now with an edge of finality. We ask that all passengers remain seated and refrain from any further disruptions for the remainder of the flight. Angela scoffed. Yeah, wouldn't want to disrupt things. Right? Lewis chuckled. Low and deep. They always say that. Because that was the thing about systems, they were built to absorb disruption. To smooth out the rough edges. To take something sharp and turn it dull so that no one had to bleed from it. But today, the wound was open, and it wasn't closing. Not yet. The last defense. From the back of the plane, Charlotte returned. Her steps were careful now. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She had spent the last few minutes trying to steady herself. To remind herself that she was not the villain here. That she was a good person. That this had never been about race. But she had heard herself speak. She had felt the way her voice had cracked. The way the moment had swallowed her whole. Made her smaller. Made her see things she did not want to see. She stopped a few rows away. Looking at Lewis. She started, but the words caught in her throat. Lewis turned his head, meeting her gaze. And suddenly, it was just the two of them. Not the plane. Not the passengers. Not the history that had led them both to this moment. Just two people standing at the edge of something neither of them could name. Charlotte swallowed. I didn't mean to. Lewis tilted his head. Waiting. I didn't know. She finally said, her voice thinner now, smaller. I didn't think it was. She stopped again. Because there was no way to finish that sentence. Because there was no way to say, I didn't know I was capable of this and still come out clean. Lewis nodded. Slow. I know, he said. And that was all. He didn't tell her it was all right. He didn't tell her he forgave her. Because forgiveness wasn't his to give. And because some things had to be carried. Had to be felt. Before they could be put down. Charlotte took a step back. Then another. Then she turned. And walked away. Not to flee. Not to escape, but because she had to sit with it. And for the first time in her life, there was nowhere left to run. The final word. The seatbelt sign dinged. The flight was beginning its descent. Angela let out a slow breath. Glancing at Lewis. Well, she said, shaking her head. That was something. Lewis smiled. Small but steady. They always ask us to be patient. He murmured. Angela huffed. Yeah, they always ask us to wait. He continued. Angela nodded. Lewis exhaled, feeling the weight of all of it pressing down on his ribs. On his skin. On the space inside him that had learned to carry things that no man should have to carry. Then he turned his head toward the window, watching as the city below came into view. And he thought, maybe, just maybe, the waiting was finally over.